Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. We're all about the places where design and development overlap. We talk with the industry experts about trends in design, development, and take a look at new ways to build digital experiences, typically over a beer or two. Ethan, so excited to have you on the podcast today. This is going to be great, guys. I'm very, very excited. This is the first episode of the Design Systems Podcast that is actually brought to you by Knapsack. That's right. Basalt has changed over from a full services digital agency over to a SaaS platform for ambitious product teams to build their design system. Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This is another quarantine episode, so forgive the fact that we're doing this out of our homes with small children running around and dogs and pets and various other things. So it may be a little bit chaotic, but regardless, we're very excited to have Ethan Marcotte. He is the father of responsive web design. He is an independent designer, writer, speaker. We're just so excited to have you. I'm very grateful for you giving us your time. Thanks so much for being on this episode.
No, hey, Chris, it's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You guys can always check out the podcast at the DS Pod. You can also check out more about Knapsack at knapsack.cloud or at knapsackcloud on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you guys about your beer recommendations, what you think, if there's any other topics you want us to hit on. Otherwise, looking forward to the chat. So first, I just wanted to kind of kick this off, as being the person that really coined what responsive web design is. You can't help but understand the parallels between what is happening in design systems with what did happen, roughly a decade ago in the responsive web design movement. And so let's start off there. Talk to me a little bit about what parallels you see right now happening and kind of both on the tech side and on the human side. What is changing in our industry that is making this whole thing this big movement?
It's interesting, Chris, because the first thing that I've been thinking about recently is when responsive design started to get traction in the industry. It was really interesting because I would go talk to clients or stakeholders and everyone would be incredibly excited about responsive design, but you talk to 10 different people, you get 10 different definitions of what responsive design was going to do for their business.
Oh, yeah.
And I kind of feel like there's an interesting parallel happening right now with, design systems all over again.
Yeah, I mean, try to have somebody define what a design system really is in a concise term. It's something that is a chronic, I guess, different representation based on who you're talking to.
Right. I mean, because it started with, pattern libraries, right? It was this really exciting, front-end movement to make things consistent and more uniform and document these UIs, but it sort of expanded, right, pretty dramatically.
Yeah, and a lot like, how responsive web design wasn't about creating mobile.mydomain.com.
Right.
It's sort of a similar thing in design systems where design systems aren't just about pattern libraries anymore. They're about a lot of things that are a lot bigger than that. I mean, I'm sure you see the parallels in your daily work, but I think that we're going to talk about a world where we built things in the digital space one way before design systems, and now we build them a different way afterward.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so to talk about parallels with responsive design, most of the organizations that I would work with when they were sort of going responsive for the very first time, they would very quickly find out that creating squishy device agnostic layouts was sort of the easy part. And then it pretty quickly highlighted a whole bunch of organizational things that maybe weren't working as well as they could have, even in the old model. And so I think same with design systems. It really quickly highlights a whole bunch of things about the organization that could be maybe working a little bit differently. Yeah,
and there's a whole lot of human change that's all a part of this too. I think that we like to say, it's a little less than half of it is the tech and a little more than half of it is the process and the people.
I love that.
And so we always think about setting up all these tools, right? Making your sketch library exactly the right way, or, building something out in Codeland in a component library and say Storybook that is exactly right for that audience. The hard part is that, if you can't get people to use those things, they're not actually all that valuable.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, to sort of approach things from the other way, it's I think a lot of organizations sort of see a design systems initiative as being that artifact, right? Replatforming their UI so that it's more component facing, or, moving a design team from Sketch over to Figma. But I think they sort of lose that opportunity to take that broader look at how are we working right now, just as a team, sort of across these different disciplines, and more broadly, how do we want to be working in the future?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good point too, in that I think the role of design and development is changing along with the advent of this new tech and this new approach. I had a big conversation with Dan Mall a few episodes back where Dan talks about the proliferation of comps being something that is a traditional artifact of the design process and how that artifact is becoming less and less relevant in a world where you need to comp less and less because the rules are defined for you. The rules of the system exist in your design system. But that's a fundamental change in the way that people work. And I'm curious if you see similar parallels and how broad those parallels reach.
I mean, I love what Dan has been saying. I mean, for years about like treating prototypes as the way in which we sort of like really vet a design and we sort of like finalize a lot of our early design thinking once we can actually get it in devices and browsers. I mean, that's definitely been true with most of the design projects that I've worked on. What I've actually found is that a lot of organizations in the early stages of their design system, they tend to get to a point where they realize they now have a whole bunch of sort of like maintenance concerns and visibility concerns to kind of deal with, you know, where one line of business might be using a slightly modified version of a component, but the design systems team may not necessarily have any visibility into how that team is working or which parts of the design system are actually working for them. So that's been really interesting for me because I think most of the clients that I've been working with are sort of like grappling with that right now.
Yeah, so like let's pull on that thread for a second. So when we talk about the impact that design systems have on our organizations and when you implement them, there's a huge ripple there. Like how far does that go? I mean, that affects broad swaths of the organization. And how does anyone ever get their mind around the scope really of what a design system is? Because we're talking about fundamentally changing the way that a business builds something.
Like this conversation could be better timed. I don't know if you follow Kim Goodwood on Twitter, but she had something today that she thought was really interesting about the biggest architectural mistake that she sees a lot of teams make is the failure to articulate like the conceptual model behind how they work and like how they want to be building things before actually just jumping in to build the thing. And I've seen that with a lot of teams like 4 or 5 years ago, go talk to a digital team, for example, and they'd be really excited about design systems. But you'd have one team that would be referring to every component in the system as an atom, and then another team would be referring to every single component as a molecule or as a template or something like that. And that's, you know, not to pick on atomic design, but like that's sort of a collaborative breakdown, right? Because, you know, folks are actually trying to bring language to the way that they work and how they need to work together, but they haven't actually had a chance to sort of sit down together to figure out like, what is the language we should be using here to talk about this system?
Take that time to develop that shared language and iterate on it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Alla Kolmatova has been talking about this for years, where she talks about like doing component inventories in your design system as a really like cross-disciplinary way, like getting different teams, different team members into the same room and actually working through the components and not just naming them, but actually talking about what they're for. And the benefit to that isn't just you're arriving on maybe better names or streamlining out some redundancies, but it's the fact that you're going to leave that room and everyone's going to understand, okay, well, we now know what this billboard component is for, and we know how to use it, and we know when to use it. And I think that's hard for a lot of design systems teams to actually work with.
Yeah, and just as an aside, Alla's book was one of the first ones I ever read that actually discussed things in terms of components and design systems. And
yeah,
I could not think of a better primer on trying to understand the implications and the impact of a design system across an organization.
Yeah, she is. She's an inspiration to me. She's been a really revolutionary in sort of changing the way that I think about like a more systems approach to designing for the web. All of her work is fantastic.
Awesome. So continuing to tease this out a little bit.
Yeah.
So we have this idea of the ripples of the design system going out across an organization. And a lot of these, if you get to the point that you want in the maturity of your design system, you're going to have consumers of that design system that you probably don't even know, that you may not have ever met inside of your organization, that you may not even actually know are using it. And so, you know, this ripple effect across this big system is interesting to explore, because what that fundamentally means is that a design system and its full effects are fundamentally unknowable, I feel like.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I think like it's unknowable on two different levels, right? Because you might be the consumer who's sort of had this, you've inherited this design system that's been sort of like designed at a level or two up in the org from you. And you've got some very real business needs that you're trying to meet at the end of the day. And you're sort of like trying to look at those against this like set of standards that you're working with. And you have to make decisions in that moment. And you might have to deviate from the standard because you're not necessarily seeing something that meets your needs, or you're not necessarily sure how to implement something. And I think that that's where, again, the other side of this visibility problem that I talk about a lot is kind of creeping in, because the higher level, the folks that are actually creating the design system, may not necessarily have any visibility into where those deviations are happening. And I think it's really difficult.
Yeah, and I think that, that's speaks to the importance of off ramps, but it also, I think, speaks to the importance of thinking about a design system like a digital product. And we go on and on about this in this podcast, but one of the things that we don't talk a lot about is the idea that products require research. And so taking the time to do your own user research as a design system product owner, where your users are other consumers inside of your organization, is a way to kind of help bridge that gap of what's known about how people are actually consuming and using it.
I think that's a fantastic point, Chris, because like when I talk about this visibility problem, a response I frequently get is, oh, well, if you can't quickly see like where a certain component is being used, why don't you build a better API so you can actually get that data? This isn't a technical problem by itself. This is something that actually requires outreach and research and looking at the ways in which the system is or is not working for you and also for different parts of your business. And it's a hard problem, but it's one that's worth investing in.
I think that my concern is that we don't talk about that enough as professionals in this industry, because I think that what you're going to see, and this actually is a little bit sad, is you're going to see kind of a rash of early failures of design systems. And I think that this is another moment that equivocates to responsive web design, where you had a bunch of people trying to implement mobile first and responsive web that fundamentally failed on their initial attempts. And it wasn't they failed because the technology wasn't at a state that was mature enough. It's that they didn't understand the implications of what they were doing for their organization.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it was interesting because a lot of the interesting early critiques about responsive design were looking at some really beautiful responsive designs that were like 40 or 50 megs in size, right? Mm-hmm. From a performance standpoint, that's terrible. But, folks would basically look at those implementations and be like, well, responsive design is too slow. And it's like, well, if you design from a perspective of like caring about performance or caring about accessibility, then you're going to have a performant and accessible responsive layout. But if those considerations are off the table, then that's not the case. It's the same with design systems too. I mean, I think like the thing that I'm most excited about right now is sort of like looking at a way in which we can start talking about design systems that actually make the consumers feel empowered to make decisions in that moment. Because I mean, right now, design systems, I think, err on the side of being very prescriptive about how they're supposed to be implemented. And in some cases, that has to be the case. But maybe there are some ways in which we can explore alternatives where, individual implementers or designers have a little bit more, I guess, freedom in terms of making some contextual decisions about what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that freedom is going to be something that is going to be necessary for organizations to really realize a lot more maturity in your design system. And we've talked a little bit about this. A design system is so much more than a component library. And when you think about, as a consumer of a design system, as a constituent inside of this organization that needs to build a digital product, what are the tools that are available to me? And a component library is just one of many that are a part of it. But I think for a lot of people, they view components as the goal. Like that is what a design system means to them. But I think that's not the right outlook, where you need to think about a whole box of tools that are a part of this and are intended to serve that constituent or that consumer.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I like to say that every organization has a design system, even if they haven't started a proper project, right? It's like they have an interface. It's probably fairly modular. It's just maybe not explicit in being a system. And then that process of actually going through and documenting everything is incredibly valuable. But at the same time, like that design system sits in a larger context of how that team works, how decisions get made about features, content, components. And I think that's something that needs to be understood before you actually start talking about the architecture of just a bunch of front-end components, because ultimately that's what you're deciding on. You're deciding on a new way for your team to work and to decide in the moment, like, okay, this is the right component to use and this is where content comes from. Here's how it's localized. Like these are all things that need to be understood to actually define an effective system. And that's hard.
So I love that. And I love how your writing really helped articulate this idea that having a component library doesn't solve a fragmentation problem. So many people go into a design systems project expecting to say, all right, I've centralized everything in this single system. Now everything shouldn't be fragmented. It should all exist in here. But the reality is like a design system isn't any one tool. It's not any one person. And so you're just shifting your fragmentation from that end product up a level. And that might be better, but it's absolutely not solving your fragmentation problem necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the way in which we think about design systems these days is that they require compliance, right? That there's a set of standards and that we're going to hew to those standards as much as possible. The fragmentation problem is kind of interesting because, ultimately, like there are going to be deviations that creep into a design system where someone's going to fork a component, someone's going to modify it because any number of reasons, right? And it's easy to look at those fragmentations and sort of think that somebody made a mistake or somebody just didn't sort of hew to the standard. But I think it's also valuable for the organization to sort of like look at those as potential lessons. What is the component not doing to serve that person's needs? What solution is it not actually presenting a solution to at that point? So, I mean, I think like that gets back to your research point from before. It's like fragmentation might actually be a healthy thing in certain circumstances, but is your organization actually in a position to learn from it?
I think that there's no more salient example than something like browser support, right? Hey, I've built this thing in a web component, and using that in IE11, if that's a requirement for my business, is really painful. Likewise, things that don't localize well. So if you think about content localization, if you have something that looks really good in the US, it may not look really good in Japan, for example. And so there's all these different parts of this that are about serving the needs of your internal users inside of organizations.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think to your point, I've always been like low-key suspicious of browser support tables anyway, because they're kind of self-fulfilling prophecies.
Dude, it should not be low-key. It is, I'm inherently suspicious of them.
Yeah, from an organizational standpoint, I understand why they exist because it's hard to do device QA, right? It's a difficult problem, and so like being prescriptive about it could be very helpful. But at the same time, there are people that are visiting our sites in devices and browsers that we don't quote unquote support. We're still giving them an experience. It's not going to be usable, but like I think that's an opportunity for a lot of organizations. And, you've mentioned accessibility a number of times today and also in previous podcasts, which is great to see. But that's absolutely the case. If somebody comes to your beautiful web component driven site in an older version of IE and they're using JAWS, what is that experience going to be designed like for them? And that's something that we need to be aware of too.
Well, and likewise, it relates back to the performance side of things as well. And performance is a form of accessibility and thinking about, how fast or how well that page loads for somebody that is in a situation where they have low bandwidth or some other sort of constraint on maybe an older device or something like that.
Oh yeah, no, I totally agree. It's like one of the best and worst things about this job is like I like thinking in terms of layers when I'm designing a page or a component, right? Like I like thinking about what's going to happen if JavaScript doesn't load for any reason or web fonts aren't available or if somebody's just tabbing through this on a keyboard. Like I think those are not easy things to think through, but they're actually kind of rewarding to sort of step through the process of being like, because those are things that I'm responsible for designing for, whether I actually do it or not. And that could be kind of fun.
Yeah. So bringing that back to the design system side of it, how do you make sure that you account for that stuff inside of your design system?
That's a great question. I think accessibility in particular is challenging because it often feels for some digital teams like this is just one more thing that they have to be worried about, right? Performance is something that I think a lot of organizations sort of ran with in the last few years, which is great. And now I think there's finally a growing awareness of, how digital accessibility matters to these companies. It's not something that can be quickly solved with just like really robustly tested front-end components. This is actually something that requires a lot of education and outreach and sort of showing people of different disciplines how they need to sort of change their workflows a little bit to think about different kinds of users. It also, in many cases, actually requires like hiring differently too, like actually working with disability-led consulting teams or actually hiring disabled designers or engineers onto your teams and listening to them, which is something that I think a lot of orgs really need to start doing as well.
It's fascinating. I've learned more about accessibility in probably the past 3 years of working in design systems than I ever did as somebody that was involved in like basically the CMS land, right? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about content and thinking about what accessible content means, but not thinking about like what an accessible experience means. And I am excited about the fact that design systems are going to allow us to build in just bake in a lot of that into our system. But I also think that it is important to realize that that's not a panacea for all of these accessibility issues that are so prevalent across the internet.
Yeah, Chris, that's beautifully said. And I think it's an important point to make because I think it's very easy, especially in our very framework focused industry, to sort of see a new system or a new framework as sort of solving accessibility for the organization, kind of like offloading those concerns like, oh, this is taking care of this problem for us. But it's invariably much deeper than that because it does touch content, it touches visual design, it touches page structure, it touches component structure. I mean, this is something that no one piece of software is going to easily solve. This is really like a broader conversation about how we're serving our users.
So thinking about that in a context of, 5 years into the future, say, where design systems are much more prevalent than they are today. Most of the larger organizations have them. And I prefer to think about this as a Star Trek-like light world than a Mad Max-like dark world, despite the environment that we're
Too
in
soon,
right
man.
now.
Too soon.
So when I think about it, I try to think about it like let's envision a future together where this has all gone really well.
Yeah.
So what does large, broad scale adoption of design systems in an industry really give us? If 5 years from now we all start to think and do the right things.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I think like I would be really excited to live in a future where design systems in 5 years look dramatically different than they do today, which are very much on the prescriptive side of the spectrum, where it's like, here is our masthead component, here is our newsletter subscription component, here is how it must be implemented. I'm much more interested in just sort of exploring some of those more descriptive approaches to defining a design system. You see that in certain parts of the Salesforce Lightning design system. You see that in certain parts of like eBay's design system, where it's not like, here is our modal component, capital M, capital C, but it's like, if you're implementing a modal in our design system, here are the characteristics that we look for as a successful implementation of it. They're doing that in part because like their technical stack is so dramatically diverse that they can't actually be as prescriptive as possible. But at the same time, like I think that's a much more sustainable approach because, again, it empowers somebody who's working with that design system to make the decisions they need in the moment that they're working. Ultimately, I think that's going to be a much more sustainable vision of design systems for the future. But I'll be prepared to be wrong about that in 5 years' time.
Yeah, well, that makes me think too about how organizations are structured today. Most of the time, when you're adopting a design system, you're really thinking about a single product first. You're not thinking about how does this impact my entire organization right now. But we are starting to see that conversation change, at least in our landscape as an agency. And so we're starting to have the conversations with senior leaders in large organizations that are talking about, well, what if we didn't design this system just to serve this one product primarily? And if other people jump on board, that's great. I think that change in the conversation is something that I'm really looking forward to in the next 5 years, starting to look at a much more broad, visionary, and much more systematic approach to this, that instead of looking at like, how do I serve this single product and frankly prove the value of a design system and reduce the risk of it before I bring it more broadly across the organization, how do we start to look at this as an organizational problem from the start?
I think that's great. Yeah. And honestly, I mean, I think you could dovetail those two versions together in some way because, at least in my experience, like as a design system scales across an organization, that's where its prescriptiveness tends to get fragile, right? Because I mean, it's harder to control a UI across different lines of business, across different products, and things quickly become unsustainable. So yeah, I'll be really curious to hear like if folks can have that conversation about the way that they want to work and design at an organizational scale, and if that changes the way that we sort of design these systems as well.
I definitely see it heading that way. I think that as this industry matures and as we get a handle around what these things really mean to organizations, and there starts to be a few more case studies, a few more ideas that make it feel safer to a lot of these big organizations, because it's a big, scary thing you're asking, right? Like,
right.
Hey, go change the way you think about design. Go change the way you think about building products.
Yeah.
That's not without its risk. And I understandably, organizations are reluctant to say, okay, from the jump, let's put everybody on this.
Sure.
And let's think about a system that serves a very broad array of needs.
Yeah. People
tend to think about it much more as a like, let's go prove this model in one place and then see if we can scale it elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I do fundamentally see like this is going to break down at some level, and we have kind of two ways forward, right? Like it either breaks down and we all decide that design systems were a huge mistake and we go back to shipping FTP files of Photoshop back and forth.
Oh man, you're singing my song.
Right? Or we all figure out ways of making them more flexible and more able to serve the needs of a broader base of people.
Yeah, I will say like the design systems teams that I've worked with in the past, and I've had some good fortune to work with them in the last year or two, are the ones that take more of like an emergent approach to planning their design system, where they can sort of define an initial set of assumptions, start to implement them, and then figure out how well they're working. See what changed, what didn't, see what's working, what's not, and then they adjust from there. And I think that's a breath of fresh air compared to some teams that are sort of like thinking in a design systems implementation approach in like a 6 to 18 month time scale. And that sort of locks you into a lot of decisions that might actually be kind of counterproductive for your organization.
Yeah, we try really hard to think about governance first
Yeah.
when it comes to these sorts of things. So how are you going to grow it? How are you going to scale it? How are you going to adopt it? How are you going to maintain it and prune it? And all of those other very human-driven aspects that should be agnostic of tools, right? Because tools are going to come and go. Coding languages are going to come and go. And like you said, organizations are really diverse. Like not everybody runs React on every single website.
Right. Right.
I threw that in there for you, Brad, if you're listening. And likewise, like not every single product is homogeneous in its needs. So it's interesting to think about how you could design a system that is there to service this broad spectrum out of the gate instead of working your way into that. But I think that where we're at right now is a lot of people are going to have to work their way into these less rigid systems.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, when I would talk to a lot of organizations, early on about like how to go responsive. So the place in which an organization was usually best served going responsive was like maybe a lower traffic part of their website or a product that maybe had a small but active audience. And that would be a place where they could actually do some design work, experiment, get some data from it, and then slowly roll it out to other parts of the organization. If you're Microsoft, maybe you just make your responsive homepage be the first thing. That's fine. I'm not going to tell Microsoft what to do. But like, I think ultimately like that for me is closer to the model of that more emergent planning I was talking about, where it's like, okay, let's find a place to experiment. Let's start to implement this and then see what we've learned and adjust course from there.
Yeah, what sort of criteria do you use when you think about that first product?
Again, I think it's about finding a space where there's relatively free room for experimentation, or maybe, from a design system standpoint, it's about finding something that maybe has a fairly small pattern set, where again, it's like, here's something that can be easily documented and understood, and then sort of like digest things from there, and then start to maybe see where that pattern set actually matches up to another product and pull things out from there. Ultimately, it's about like just starting from map making, I think, first and foremost, and then sort of see how that territory kind of like applies to other parts of the organization.
Yeah, I also think about it in terms of who's a willing product owner, right? Like who's your willing guinea pig?
Right. Right.
Because they're going to be taking on a lot of risk and potentially burning a lot of political capital inside of their own organization to take on an initiative like this. And so you have to have that champion that is
right,
like ready to put their head down and just work through what is inevitably a little bit painful of a process.
Yeah, I think that's right too. And their teams have to be on board as well, because this might require them learning new skills, adopting new tools and tool sets. Yeah, I think, again, like you said, sort of having that top-down advocate makes a huge difference.
So we've talked a ton about the human side of design systems and the need to be thinking very broadly and also not being too prescriptive about the way that you implement these things. But I am curious, because we're both kind of in technical disciplines and, we have a shared love of tools, I think. Where do you see the really cool shit happening in design systems? Like, what is the stuff that you're like, wow, that's amazing?
Well, as a designer, I mean, I guess most of my heart right now is really just like messing around with CSS Grid. And the thing that I love about it is it just feels like stuff I wish I had 10 years ago. It's an incredibly powerful layout tool, first and foremost, but it's like slowly and subtly rewiring my brain about like what I can do with layout on the web. And my brain's just really been firing on all cylinders about how I can sort of like think about this in a more reusable and sustainable way at scale. So yeah, that's where my heart's been. More broadly than that, like I've been sort of tinkering a little bit, both with Salesforce's Theo and then Style Dictionary from Amazon. I mean, it's kind of interesting, like, getting to a point in design systems as a community where we have things to manage something like design tokens, but these are interesting ways of thinking about like token architecture at a very broad level. And those have been kind of fun to play with.
That's actually really interesting. We started with Theo in Knapsack and we actually went to Style Dictionary.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
As a part of it. And so, we love them both. I think that they're really great. Yeah, I mean, that management of tokens and that idea of like what we can do with tokens. And speaking of Salesforce, they're starting to do some really interesting stuff with like multivariate tokens and these ideas of like these higher order components, which I don't particularly love the name higher order component because I think it kind of makes it hard to understand what it's all about.
Right.
But the idea of like, let me take a collection of components or a grouping on my page and change the behavior of just that set of components when I actually go view that page. And that's really cool, right? Because we always talk about personalization, for example, right? So personalization in the realm of content is something that's pretty well understood. Like I can, serve up a piece of content that matches what kind of user is visiting my website. But what if you could actually change the full experience of that page based upon that user?
Sure.
Like you could have a whole different variable set applied to your components that makes the behavior of the page totally different. Like think of the possibilities there.
Yeah, it's wild. 2020 is a weird and exciting time. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, you could say that again.
Yeah.
Thinking about some of the other stuff that's kind of cool that's coming along. How do you see the role of content in a design system? I think that this is something that has a place, and I think we all know it has a place, but it's been a place that's not like super well defined yet. Where do you see that going?
It's the one part that always seems to be missing from a lot of design system discussions that I tend to have with teams is where's the content coming from? What services provide it? Who's actually digesting it and where? What are the constraints that I'm designing for when I'm working with a specific component? I think that's one of those things. It's interesting to me that like this is the engine that powers our websites, but the folks actually implementing that engine aren't usually part of a lot of the design systems discussions that I tend to be part of. So I've been working at least in the last like couple years, like having conversations with folks like Karen McGrain and Jeff Eaton, who come from, sort of deep content modeling backgrounds, talking to them about like how this intersection between like content modeling and design systems planning really needs to sort of like be interwoven a lot more closely together. And so, I'm learning a lot from both of them, but that's something that, I really feel like needs to be a much, much bigger part of the conversation.
Well, as an aside, I used to work with Jeff back in the Drupal community for a long
fantastic.
time. And
Yeah.
man, if you're getting advice from him, he's the right guy. Like he's got a brilliant head for what the future of content is really all about. So
yeah,
that's awesome.
Yeah, I learned a lot from Jeff and from Karen. They're both pretty remarkable.
I think about the content, I guess, space inside of design systems is this place where we haven't really quite gotten to yet because we're not totally sure how to solve that need, right? We're looking at design systems almost as this service layer for experiences that exists for digital products. And so there's this traditional division of, hey, I have content as a service. Hey, I have experience as a service now with design systems. Hey, I have backend as a service with a traditional API. So in this microservices architecture, is a design system more like a CMS or more like an API? Or is that distinction even really matter anymore?
That's a great question. I'm not the person to answer it, but I do think like the thing that I've always found interesting is like looking for those points of overlap between the different spokes on the wheel. And that's the worst metaphor I've ever said out loud. But like, ultimately these things don't live in a vacuum, and understanding in which design system is dependent on the back end, the content management system, marketing teams, the different inputs into that system ultimately define the system too. And we're not always thinking about those from an organizational standpoint. Those need to be part of the conversation, definitely.
Well, hey, Ethan, it's been super great to talk to you. I really appreciate, again, your time and coming on this. What are you working on these days? I know you made the decision to go independent not terribly long ago. What's that all about, man?
Yeah. Thanks for asking, Chris. Yeah, no, I've been independent for a good chunk of my career, but I just wrapped up a little over a year working with the team at Vox Media. Fantastic organization. I miss all the people dearly, but, I was just sort of champing at the bit to get back out there and sort of like working on some design systems with different kinds of organizations. And but I learned a lot from my time there. But kind of excited to be back under my own steam. The timing could be a little bit different, I guess, but it's been good so far. Working on my own website, ethanmarcotte.com, has actually been like not just a business thing for me. It's like actually been incredibly relaxing with everything that's been going on to just sort of have like this really discrete space to kind of design and experiment with. And that's been incredibly helpful for me. So it's been a fun playground to work in. Yeah,
prepping for this has been great to spend some time there actually and read a lot of your writing.
I appreciate that.
I love the tone of it all, and I think that you're onto some really great stuff, unsurprisingly.
That means a lot. Thank you. It's been fantastic meeting you and being part of the podcast. This is a really great show you got going on.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate it. And again, thanks so much for your time. For the first time, this podcast has been brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud or at knapsackcloud on Twitter. Thanks so much, guys. Bye. That's all for today. We'd love to hear from you with questions, ideas for new episodes, beer recommendations, or comments. You can find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. Cheers, and thanks for listening to the Design Systems Podcast.